How do we explore the links between human rights and the SDG 1, 2, 5 and 17? And to facilitate that part of the session, I'll give the floor to Joan Carlin from the Indigenous Peoples Major Group to guide us through the process. So I'd just like to thank you very much for participating so far, and we'll move quickly to the next session. Please, Joan, the floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone. Now we're moving to session 2 after discussing the broad relations and linkages of human rights and SDGs. We're now going to zoom into particular goals that are the focus goals of the high-level political forum this year. In particular, we will be looking at the specific links of human rights to Goal 1 on ending poverty, Goal 2 on ending hunger, and Goal 5 on gender equality. So without much ado, I'm privileged to call one of the best experts on human rights, Mr. Greg McIver, Chief Development and Economic and Social Issues Branch from the OHCHR. He heads the Development and Economic and Social Issues Branch at the OHCHR in Geneva, a lawyer and specialist in international human rights law, policy and methodology, and he has served the UN since January of 1992. As chief of the Human Rights and Development Team in the 1990s, McIver led the development of the OHCHR original work on human rights-based approaches to development and human rights-sensitive definitions of poverty. So, sir, kindly take the floor.
Right here.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Much appreciated. So, in terms of lessons learned, I think it's important to look at what were the lessons learned that brought us the SDGs in the first place. And the most fundamental lesson that we learned over more than half a century was that development done wrong does harm. Development done wrong can devastate the rights of indigenous peoples, it can devastate labor rights, it can do harm to national economies, it can be destructive of the environment, and it can really do a lot of harm to the human rights of people. The other side of that is that development done right can advance the international human rights agenda, can advance the rights of human beings. And the premise here is that the SDGs offer the first real opportunity, framed as a development agenda, to do development right from a human rights perspective and from other perspectives as well. The environment always comes to mind. And I think at this moment in history it's particularly important because the SDGs have provided us with an opportunity to dismantle what has been the dominant economic and development paradigm of the last 40, 50 years, which has been extremely destructive to our planet and to our human rights. It is, if you want it to be, a radical departure from that old dominant paradigm. The other thing that I want to say about it is that, we've been talking about human rights-based approaches for decades now. This is the first intergovernmentally agreed development agenda, which is explicitly human rights-based. And I just want to spend a minute proving that, because sometimes you can be forgiven for being frustrated by what we did not get from member states with the adoption of the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. It's important to recognize the remarkable things that we did get. It's true that the goals are not expressed as the right to health, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to fair trial, and so on, which is pure human rights language. But nevertheless, this is the first time where you have such an effective interface for the international human rights framework and a development agenda that the two actually snap together with an audible click, as we like to say. First, because this agenda is universal. So with one swipe of the pen or bang of the gavel, we have a situation now where we're not talking about the developed world lecturing to the developing world, or worse, governments or development agencies lecturing to their people on what this is supposed to be all about. This is about freedom from fear and freedom from want for all people without discrimination everywhere, north and south and east and west. Secondly, for the first time, we have a development agenda that at the meta level, if you read across the goals, actually provides a home for all parts of the international human rights framework. That wasn't the MDGs. The The MDGs were a narrow set of socioeconomic goals that didn't provide you an opportunity to focus, as this agenda does, on the full range of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the right to development, and including a laser focus on inequalities and on discrimination. And if you read across the goals, you'll find a home for all of those areas of human rights. The other element that makes it so explicitly human rights based is the degree of attention given to inequalities and discrimination, specifically. Out of those 17 goals, 2 of them entirely dedicated to inequalities. And if that's not enough, in the narrative, in a number of goals, in some specific targets, in indicators, and in the requirement of disaggregation across all the goals, and across the longest list of grounds for disaggregation, not just gender and geography anymore, but a whole range of areas of disaggregation to get at the groups who are excluded from the benefits of development. That makes it an explicit human rights group. It contains the longest litany of special groups of any international agenda ever before: indigenous peoples and older persons and children and youth and women, small farmers, persons with disabilities. I could go on and on, because the agenda correctly does go on and on, because a human rights-based approach to development has at its center one question, and the question is who. It's the who of development. It's the who of the economy. Who is it for? And the agenda does a good job of answering that for the first time. Also, what you will do if you look across some of the targets is you will find a lot of the adjectives that are drawn from the international human rights framework that are reflected. They're not all there in every target, but you will find repetition of concepts like availability, accessibility, affordability, qualitative indicators as well, that align perfectly with notions, for example, of economic and social rights and international human rights law. The notion of accountability adopted by this agenda is very different from the notions of accountability previously, which were very north-south ideas of accountability. This is one that reframes accountability to talk about the accountability of everybody to the rights holders, to the people, to the beneficiaries or victims of development, depending on what you do. Accountability is to the people in this agenda, whether you are a country of the South or a country of the North. The notion of participation is a very 21st century notion of participation. The agenda was developed the way that it developed because there was so much participation in that agenda. You wouldn't have gotten this agenda if it were only governments that participated in its formulation. We can be pretty sure of that. And its success rests on the degree to which we secure free, active, and meaningful participation of all of the groups mentioned and of all the beneficiaries of development at all levels of the implementation and monitoring and reporting on the SDGs. That means carving out sufficient civil society space at the national level for the full and meaningful engagement of communities and constituencies. And it also means moving past these archaic, old-fashioned modalities of participation here in this building at the global level in order to ensure meaningful participation of all stakeholders beyond what it has been in the past. But there's a half a line in the agenda, which for me is the most important half line in the agenda, which is the proof that it is a human rights-based agenda. And that is the line that says that the agenda must be implemented, and I quote, in a manner consistent with the obligations of states under international law, including their human rights obligations. That means we are talking about the right to health, the right to education, the right to water and sanitation, the right to fair trial, and so on. You have to implement those goals if you're to be true to the agenda in a manner consistent with your human rights obligations. The agenda says so explicitly. And then the last thing I'll say that's remarkable about this agenda represents the return of the state. You will be forgiven for thinking over the course of the last 40 years that good practice was dissolving and weakening the role of the state in protecting people's human rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural. This agenda requires the state to have robust capacities to make sure that sustainable development is achieved, that people have social protection, that there is decent work, that there is adequate housing and health, and that the first duty bearer is the duty bearer of the state. Now, I want to say as well that it is not a panacea, it's not perfect, it's a political document negotiated by member states, and so there are risks and gaps and challenges, as the question suggested. The first one, of course, is the risk of the smorgasbord approach. That we already see some member states indicating that, yes, this is an integrated agenda, nice that all this equality stuff is there and so on. We'll take some of this, but we don't want any of that. So we'll focus on oceans, but don't talk to us about inequalities, for example. And the minute that starts happening, the agenda falls apart, because as Sarah said, it's constructed as an interdependent agenda. And we know that this agenda is a political agenda as well, and politics is about power, and that means who chooses which goals and targets are focused on becomes absolutely essential in the implementation of the agenda. Maximum participation by people and affected communities is essential. Secondly, we've heard about the private sector, which has a recognized role in this agenda, but the agenda, as strong as it is on encouraging the engagement of the private sector, is relatively weak on the accountability of the private sector. And I'm sure our private sector friends in the room will recognize that just as the private sector can play a role in meeting the SDGs, private sector actors sometimes play a role in undercutting labor rights, human rights, the environment. I don't think I'm saying anything surprising to anybody in this room. And without adequate accountability, not just CSR, but real accountability for private sector actors, we won't get to where we need to go. And then the last thing I'll say is that there are plenty of little things, negotiated language in the agenda that can undercut human rights. For example, caveats about in accordance with national law. And what I would say about that is this is another reason why those who care about human rights and sustainable development need to be very engaged in the way that this agenda is applied, is because whatever those caveats of national law are, they don't trump the language that says it has to be in accordance with the obligations of states, including their international human rights obligations. We need to make sure that that happens as well. Now, I'm going to stop in just a minute, but I just want to say there are plenty of good matrices out there done by the Danish Institute, done by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and so on, where you can see on the left-hand side goals and targets and indicators in the column, and in the right-hand side you can look to see where those correspond with international human rights standards. We've already said that at the meta level they do correspond, and quite directly. On ending poverty, this idea of a multi-dimensional idea of poverty, which has been embraced by the international human rights movement for decades now, and by the international development community for quite a long time as well, means that you cannot look at poverty from a perspective of goal one. If you miss the fact that people who are living in poverty recognize poverty is not just about resources, but it's also about choices and security and power, then you realize that goal 16 is as much about poverty as is goal 1, and so are so many of the other goals. So are the inequality goals as well. One needs to take a look at that as well. On zero hunger, that is another way of expressing the right to adequate food, because it sets a zero target, which means that's a human rights target. No more of this tolerance of, well, we'll let 50% of the people currently hungry starve to death, and we'll see if we can save the low-hanging fruit on the other side. That was not a human rights approach. The current approach really is, and you'll see among the targets a number of things that correspond directly to language from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so on. Finally, on gender equality, completely, but in human rights standards relating to discrimination against women and girls, violence against women and girls, very progressive human rights ideas like recognizing the value of unpaid care. And again, here's the role of the state, making sure there are public services in place for care so that you don't have a disproportionate burden of care left legislation In other words, accountable legal accountability, just as called for by the Universal Declaration and by CEDAW and by the CRC. And I think the last goal that we're looking at in this discussion is the Global Partnership Goal, Goal 17, that gets at fundamental human rights challenges like fair taxation, like debt, like equitable trade, but very importantly, ideas of policy coherence. And here we're talking about, it doesn't make any sense to meet at the international level and talk about intellectual property or trade or investment and pretend that you can talk about those issues without reference to your international human rights obligations. This agenda says you have to. If you've got intellectual property regimes that are undercutting access to medicines, including which are required for the right to health, those things must be dismantled. So I think I have no idea, I'm not keeping track of time, so I think I'm going to stop there just to say that this agenda will be an advancement of the international human rights movement if we insist that it must be. Thank you.
Thank you for that very insightful elaboration on the link of the SDGs to human rights, as well as flagging some of the key challenges and gaps. Now I open the floor for some questions. I'll take 3 questions and then we'll ask Craig to answer. Any questions? We only have a few minutes for this, but this is an opportunity for the participants to ask questions in relation to the presentation. Okay, I see a hand at the back. Yeah. And second and third. Okay. Can we have...
Yes, thank you. Sam from Hong Kong, China, with the Major Group. It's really nice to hear that you mentioned the right to health matter, because I know that the Human Rights Council recently passed a resolution on rights to health. But I also understand that actually some country also had some pushback for the exact language, in specifically about the access to affordable pharmaceutical products. And we have the UN High-Level Panel on Access to Medicine, which recommendation also were pushed back by a lot of people. So with regards to rights to health, which is, I believe, is one of the most difficult thing to push forward in the coming decades, how do we move forward? And what's your experience? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, the one over there.
Yeah, my name is Philip from World Evangelical Alliance. The question is to ILO. Just like to know if there is a minimum standard of wages in the Gulf region, GCC. The minimum wage is $130.
Sorry, the ILO is not
and
here.
You can record it later on. You can pass it on to him. $130. Don't stop me. Don't. $130 is all they earn for a month. How can you raise the minimum standard? And I don't see any GCC representation here. And what is the stand of ILO? And I've talked to all research organizations here, and they said that there is no alternative way. So what can be done? We have 7 million from India and other countries in Gulf region sitting there, semi-skilled and low-skilled. I'm not talking about skilled or refugees. I'm talking about workers. This is $130 is inclusive of a remittance. All right, so then you deduct that, it is going to be $70. No savings, no microfinance models. So ILO, if there is any model that they can give it to me, it'll be nice. I think the labor rights is also human rights. Thank you.
My name is Hope Muli from Kenya, and my question is in regards to the linkages between public contracting and human rights. We all know that a lot of delivery of public goods, services, and public works will determine the kind of quality of life that citizens will enjoy. And if this is not linked and we are not seeing indicators, reporting, and mechanisms examining how open and what integrity is in our contracting and our public contracting, we may not actually leave more people behind than we are purporting to see.
Okay. Thanks for that. Craig, do you want to respond to these 3 questions on health, labor, and public contracting?
Yeah, I think these questions get right to the heart of the matter. I mean, there's no question that the right to health is an internationally guaranteed human right, the right to the highest attainable standard of mental and physical health. including addressing the underlying determinants, the obligation for which is principally on the state, and by extension, the international community of states through international cooperation, which is itself, by the way, under international human rights law, an obligation, a legal obligation on all member states. And as you point out, there is a defense of other concerns that are sometimes put forward to trump people's right to health. And what I have suggested is that the 2030 Agenda offers an opportunity to challenge that. Goal 17 talks specifically about policy coherence. We have said that policy coherence means that it has to be also coherent with your obligations. The agenda says it has to be consistent with your obligations under international law. Goal 17 also talks about policy space, which means, for example, the space of a government to protect public health before it worries about some of these archaic intellectual property protections, to have flexibilities in order to do so. And I think we need, again, it's a political challenge, we need to assert that as vigorously as we possibly can, that human rights comes first in that. I don't know what to say. The second question, I agree. Labor rights are human rights. The part of decent work is a decent wage as well. I think the agenda tries to address those issues as well, and I think if Vinicius was here, he'd be able to give you a fuller answer. But I think it's an absolutely relevant point because it's also a part of internationally guaranteed economic and social rights, including under the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, the Universal Declaration, and of course so many ILO instruments, again, in accordance with the obligations of states under international law. It includes human rights law, includes labor law. I think a very important point about public contracting, and you see a lot of discussion around the agenda on things like public-private partnerships, on issues of contracting out essential state functions and so on. And that's one of the I think, most important needs in implementation, is to make sure there are good safeguards in place so that any of those arrangements in the first interest protect the public interest, number one, protect human rights, labor rights, and the environment, more specifically with regard to the public interest, and that are reviewed publicly and transparently to make sure that the distribution of costs and benefits is actually in the interest of sustainable development and human rights, not where what has happened quite often in the past, and might even be the dominant model for such arrangements, where the public absorbs the costs and the private entity on the other side of the contract makes the profits and the benefits out of it. That's not a model which can work with the SDGs and a sustainable development agenda. And the only way to make sure that doesn't happen is to have those explicit safeguards and to make sure that it's a transparent process. And I think here again we heard about the guiding principles on business and human rights, the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights that provide a framework for dealing with the private sector in human rights terms. That become very important in this context, and those are an accountability sandwich, I always like to say. The guiding principles on business and human rights say that you have to make sure that that the government, that the state protects human rights as against harms from third-party actors like the private sector, that businesses respect human rights in all of their business activities, and thirdly, that remedies are available for whenever those harms are done in spite of that. Has to apply here as well in terms of accountability of private sector actors.
Thank you very much, Craig. Let's give a round of applause for this very insightful presentation. Now we go back to the Mentimeter. There are two questions. Okay. So this is a quiz. The first question is, what percentage of SDG targets is linked to human rights standards? Okay, then the next question. So, what is this? Okay, which human rights instrument has the most links to the SDGs? You have three options there. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, and the Covenant for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Answer? Yes. So, for those who answered right, let's give them a round of applause. Okay, now...
I wonder about that one.
You wonder about that one. Okay, we can...
It seems to me there's no wrong answer.
Yeah, right. So yes, you're right, definitely. There are no wrong answers because all these instruments have direct link to human rights. It's more the one with the most. So now we move on to an exercise, a group exercise, if I may say. There's a piece of paper, because we're now looking into the SDGs as the direct or the specific targets in goals 1, 2, and 5, which is distributed. Now, the exercise is that those people can talk together in 2 or 3, to look into the links of the targets to human rights, and see what is the value added of the human rights and SDG links, and the value added in terms of how you can use it in relation to your work. And so you're given 5 minutes to discuss amongst yourselves. Is that fine? Is the instruction clear? The paper that's distributed to you that has the goals, the targets, and the human rights links. Do you see it? It's on goal 1, goal 2, and goal 3. So those are the clear examples, those of the links. Because we're now looking at the links of human rights to the SDGs. So let's go into the specific ones. And in your discussion, in your little group discussion, the question is, what are the added value of these links in terms of your work, or how in the promotion of human rights and SDGs in your work? Yeah, and since we don't have time to get it back here, then you just put your response to the Mentimeter. Okay, so I'll be quiet for 5 minutes, and everybody works. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so it's okay. Yeah, it's okay.
Let me see if I can get Jocelyn over here, because in the very last bit, I'm going to be the moderator, so I'm going to have her come over here. We can put it on the page, right? Put it up on the page. Yeah, of course.
Quite nice. The story is that we did an activity today, right? And turned out at the end.
I love you too much, Really trying to get railroads, you know? They take the road.
Sorry. I like this one. Sounds like Mama Time.
Sorry, folks. Time's up. Time's up. So better wrap up your discussion. I hope this has been an interesting exercise. And please upload your response to the Mentimeter. Yeah. Wrap up. Now, can we now? Okay, the guy at the back, can I ask you to please read some of the response so we know how the exercise? Yes, please.
In the top left, so giving justice to peoples brings a more concrete framework to apply the principles to implementation and accountability. Next one says it provides accountability as well. Sort of second from the left, top left. The rights aspect allows us to tie to systems at national level, such as constitution. Shall I keep going?
Yeah.
Do you want me to read them all? SDGs provide a universal political framework that is aligned with the international legal framework of human rights. SDGs are a framework for promoting human rights in specific sectors. Dignity holds governments accountable to the way SDGs are implemented. On access to affordable medicines, this link gives a stronger message and advocacy opportunity targeting civil society and business sectors.
Okay.
Is that enough?
Yeah, I think those are that shows the different perspective as well in looking into the how the link of human rights to SDGs can actually support the work that we're doing from different sectors. So let's give ourselves a round of applause for this exercise. I hope that was very useful. Now we move on to the key human rights issues that relates to Goal 1 and 2, which is on poverty and food security. We have two speakers here. One is from an indigenous community. He's an indigenous leader. And interestingly, we also have one from the business sector to also present their work in relation to food security. So first, I'll call on Emily Demiro. Did I say it right? Yeah, Demiro, sorry. She's from Nestle. She leads the development of the Nestle in the U.S. Creating Shared Value Report. She has a background in designing and supporting operations of food security and agricultural development programs. Emily holds an MS in Agriculture, Food and Environment from the Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policies. So Emily, take the floor, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. At Nestle, we're really honored to be included in this conversation. First, to begin with some context. Nestle is present in 191 countries around the world. We deliver more than 1 billion servings of food and beverages to individuals and families every day. And we're driven by our purpose, enhancing quality of life and contributing to a healthier future. We recently defined 3 overarching ambitions for 2030, which guide our work and support the achievement of the UN SDGs. These include improve 30 million livelihoods in communities that are directly connected to our business activities, help 50 million children live healthier lives, and strive for zero environmental impact in our operations. Human rights is a critical element of how we operate. In 2008, we began partnering with the Danish Institute for Human Rights on our Human Rights Due Diligence program. This program has enabled us to systematically embed human rights across all of the policies that govern the way we operate, our employee behavior, and our relationships with suppliers. And we continue to partner with the Institute to conduct human rights impact assessments in identified high-risk countries that present several high-risk commodities and labor risks. About 1.5 years ago, we identified our 11 salient human rights issues and corresponding action plans for these. We've worked with the Institute to map our salient human rights issues against the SDGs and targets. There's a handout that I passed around the room. There are some piles at certain places on the tables that show the results of this mapping of the targets with the salient issues. And look for a report that we'll have coming out later this year on this topic. In May of this year, we published our Labor Rights Roadmap, which identifies where our salient human rights issues occur across our 20 global priority commodities and geographies and forms the basis for our actions. We identified that 8 out of these 11 issues were primarily found in our upstream agricultural supply chain, and these form the basis for our work. We will begin reporting against this roadmap in 2018. As part of our responsible sourcing program, we are working with third-party organizations, including the Forest Trust, Verite, Fair Labor Association, and more, to implement this roadmap. Just last month, we hosted a labor rights workshop in which we convened 12 of our partners to discuss how can we better work together to address these human rights challenges in our supply chain. Collaboration to address these challenges is critical because we're working to leverage the specific expertise of our partners, but also to build capacity in areas in which they're not as strong, because we'd like to enhance our ability to have a comprehensive approach in working with these partners on these assessments and remediation. As an example, we're about to embark on a human rights impact assessment of our palm oil supply chain in Indonesia. For the first time, after 2 years of really focusing these impact assessments on our own operations, we will be working with a supplier in Indonesia and 2 third-party organizations. Our rural development strategy is key to efforts to achieve targets against goals 1 and 2. We source from millions of farmers around the world, and we directly source from 719,000 farmers. Rural poverty represents a huge challenge to our long-term ability to source safe and high-quality raw materials, and this is why we've committed to improving the farm economics of the farmers who supply us. Through our Farmer Connect program, we enhance livelihoods through a range of support. We train farmers and provide technical assistance. We are also training farmers and their families on nutrition. We found that there are weaknesses in food security and dietary diversity in the communities from which we source, so we're working on designing programs to address that challenge. And we're helping, as an example of this, we're helping farmers develop and maintain kitchen gardens and livestock for nutrition. And just to conclude, I want to acknowledge that while we've been working on these issues for about 8 or 9 years, we're really just at the beginning, and we have a long way to go. We're a big company, we have a hugely complex supply chain, and we recognize that there are many human rights challenges that we are addressing. We're working hard to proactively identify these challenges and mitigate the risks in our supply chain, but we must continue to work collaboratively and engage across multiple sectors. We fully recognize that we cannot solve these issues alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily, for presenting at least the work that you're doing in promoting human rights in your value chain. Now we move on to the realities on the ground in relation to the issue of poverty and food security. I have the pleasure to introduce a long-time Maasai activist from Kenya. He has an extensive work on land rights, livelihoods, extractive industries in northern Kenya. So it's my pleasure to introduce Johnson Ole Kaunga from Impact.
Thank you very much. I think I will discuss the whole issue about ending poverty and also ending hunger, and the whole question about discrimination or issue relating to the Goal 5. I think to me a number of issues need to be really made clear. I think from the perspective of Kenya and a number of countries, the indigenous peoples still remain invisible. So, and it's very difficult to address these issues if people, if we talk about leaving no one behind, and then a considerable proportion of the population is still invisible, then I think there's something that we are not really getting clear there. I mean invisible in terms of being visible at a policy, having a policy and legal recognition. A number of African countries still are not recognizing indigenous peoples. In a Kenyan context, this could be the pastoralists, some fishing communities, some agro-pastoralists and hunter-gatherers. And when we talk about poverty and these groups or category of citizens are actually natural resource dependent. And we are talking about people who from time to time are being uprooted from their lands where they depend upon for food. A good example here is, for instance, linking it to business. Like Turkana Wind Power is the largest wind farm in Africa, $76 billion, and it has taken about 150,000 acres of land from local populations, and it denied that these are not indigenous peoples. Whether they are indigenous or not, I think it puts them to some risk and vulnerability. I think to me, if companies, governments are putting rigorous efforts to map out vulnerabilities related to different categories of groups of people, the way they put those efforts in terms of mapping resources, it would really be very helpful. We invest a lot of resources mapping natural resources within those lands, but we don't put efforts to identify different forms of vulnerabilities, distinct groups of people who live different lives. I think in this way we need to address that gap. I think we are dealing with a number of issues. The whole question about rights, right to land. We are dealing about resources, natural resources, and the whole issue about representation and recognition of those people. In this area, when you talk about recognition, recognizing them at the policy level, practice, legal recognitions. And this is where we have a great areas in a number of countries. And I think when you talk about ending poverty, but at the same time you are not addressing access to rights to land and natural resources, then I think we will not be meeting those targets that we have aspired to at some point. And I think when we talk about indigenous women, I think considering the fact that indigenous peoples are themselves marginalized and they are recognized in the Kenyan constitutions, and I think the women are even much more invisible in terms of vulnerabilities and poverty. They are hidden. They are even because certain cultural, while indigenous peoples have strong cultural values, but certain cultures really relegate the position of women. But I want to also challenge one thing that's going around, the issue about economizing, or making the role of, or commercializing the role of women or to pay them for them to be to make their work being paid at home. To me, it's very good. But I think the women contribute a lot in terms of holding those families together. Institutions that make them participate need to be recognized. because that's a way for them to participate in a number of ways. But because of they are socially excluded geographically, they tend not to participate.
Thank you for that presentation, and also putting emphasis or including the issues of indigenous women. Now we have another Mentimeter, so people can see what are the key human rights issues related to SDGs 1 and 2. That's the question for... It's yeah. This is an open exercise. So just put in the keywords that you think are linked to ending poverty or reducing poverty and for food security. So it's interesting to see what you think are the human rights issues in relation to these goals. Just put the keywords. Keywords. There's a word that I don't see that has been presented by our speakers here. Okay, now I see it. No, it's the women's rights that I want to see, because that's very much linked to 1 and 2. And it's coming out. So, okay. That's an interesting exercise. So if we look at, yes, the land is the main word that everybody's putting. Second is equality, dignity, food. Okay? Okay, thank you for joining again that exercise. Now we move on to another set of speakers who will share strategies for achieving SDG 1, 2, and 5, and they will actually focus on Goal 5, which is on gender equality. I would like to call on our first speaker for this. She's an activist and leader for the defense of the human and collective rights of indigenous peoples, promoter of the ILO Reconstitution, and has participated in the national marches in defense of territory and life, in the Constituent Assembly of Bolivia, and elaboration of public policies, initiator of Constitution of the Council of Mama Talias and Alliance of Indigenous Women of Bolivia for the defense of their human and collective rights. May I call on Turibia Lero Quispe, Coordinadora Andina de Organizaciones Indígenas in Bolivia. Turibia, take the floor, please.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Good afternoon to everyone, to all sisters and brothers. I would like to say that we are gathered here today, not everyone, to address the construction of the building of a better world, the world framework as the SDGs are, so that no one is left behind. I represent the indigenous peoples of the Andes of the South America. I'm the coordinator of the indigenous organizations in the Andean countries, Ecuador, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, and the north of Argentina. We are countries impoverished since the Spanish colonization. You know that we've been exploited, we've been rid of our natural resources, but our ancestors have bought our resources with gold and silver, and that's why I'm here, happy to share this opportunity here in this SDGs to build a new world and to be not left behind again. I'd also like to say that from 2012, Indigenous women have been following up this process when back then when the outcome document were developed with the Millennium Objectives, and then we realized that we were not being taken into account. And so we realized that we not only need to be talking about human rights, but also about the rights of Mother Earth, because that's the fundamental base to get to that better world, to get to that world where we can all share it. I'd also like to share that at that moment we need to encourage in the local, national, regional and global level that we have to change our mentality so that women and men can love the nature, Mother Earth, because she is the one that gives us life, gives us safeguard, and gives us food and life. So that's why we say that hunger and poverty, the physical, material, emotional, spiritual hunger shouldn't be a business. Hunger shouldn't be a way of expanding agricultural industries that produce with glyphosates, that produce food with chemical products that poison us. Not because we have hunger, we need to produce transgenic products. We do have to come back to the natural products. Only through that can we save ourselves from this world that is already polluted, because during a lot of years we have facilitated pollution through mining, agricultural, oil companies, electrical companies. But unfortunately, we're also seeing on the local level, I bring here my sisters and my young tears because they're helpless and they don't know where to complain about this process that we have been started to start on SDGs, but we also face violation, persecutions, murders of leaders, because they are defending their lands and territories. I don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to wrap up by saying that economical growth cannot be based on extractive industries, that indigenous peoples should be based on reports, disaggregated data by gender and by region, and also tell you that this agency needs to be built by countries and by communities in a consensual way, because I understand that everyone understands this, but in the local level there's no information, there's no dissemination. People need to be trained, leaders, women, men needs to be trained so that everyone can be engaged in this process, because if only a few can deal with these topics, can do certain things, but the most marginalized, the most disadvantaged ones are going to be the ones that are always left behind. And I hope that this will be more productive, sisters and brothers and sisters.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy that you have also highlighted the challenges that land and environmental defenders are facing. We are very much aware that the killings of land rights defenders are still happening across the globe, and this should be stopped. It's the point also of the participation of everybody, of everyone, is critical for the achievement of the SDGs. So now it's my pleasure to introduce another speaker. He's working as the Subsecretary of the Argentinian National Human Rights Institution. He is also a member of GANDRI, and doing very interesting and important work at the national level, not only promoting human rights, but also the issues or rights of women. So may I call on Juan Jose Boquel, Defensor de la Nación Argentina. Let's give a...
Muchas gracias por todo.
Thank you. I'd like to be very brief because here right next to me, I'll leave the floor to the coordinator of the SDG, who's Maria Garcia Blanco. I'd like to just strengthen that we started a follow-up and review process of the SDG 2015. And at that moment, we did 57 research that involve other goals and other targets. There are still a long way to go, but we needed technicians and other professionals and specialists to be able to involve them all. In the future, in the short future, we expect this to happen and to involve the 169 targets. But we had a first report that we have launched at Gangi and also at the permanent mission to the UN. This talks about not only about the program, but also the progress report on the research that we've done. And also one of the research that we've done concluding with the final recommendation. This includes the resolution and about 2 pages of recommendation to the state. The first result that we had after all this research was that Argentina, our institutions, had to report to, had to do the universal periodic review. We for the first time, we had to report on the 168 recommendations. We did this through all the recommendations from based on the SDG, and we built on not only from the international organizations, but also through the civil society. So I'll leave with that, and I'll leave the floor to the specialist on gender.
Un pequeño speech para decir, pero
I had a little speech to say, but I'm going to modify it because I don't have a lot of time. If we think about the SDG 5 and the target 5.1, which is remove gender violence in private and public environment, we see that the objective is pretty ambitious and pretty extensive, and with a deadline of 2030. The state says that it should be able to do it by 2028. We, as the institution, can't establish public policies, but what we do is the monitoring of the public policies that each government realizes. So I think an important thing to consider is that apart from talking about the numerical indicators, we also need to talk about the alpha targets. But it's not. We are not supposed to only reach the numerical targets, but also the alphanumerical targets too. And if we go to target 5.1c, this is one of the alphanumerical targets that I'm talking about. It talks about the gender, and what we do here year by year is we take those targets, alphanumerical targets, and we monitor with the NGOs, with the state, and with the civil society, what's the progress done based on that target. In, for example, HIV, that we're actually researching, a foundation called WESPED in our country, and another foundation like FAIN, which is based on the gender equality. in the ECOSOC, we gather, we ask their recommendation, and then we get to the final resolution. And what my colleague has just said, we are going to finish our first research in 2017. The following year, we're going to follow up, and then we see if the government has achieved them, will achieve them, or already is achieving them. So that's what we do, and that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for also highlighting your work on monitoring the targets together with civil society organizations. I think that's a very important aspect in the implementation, monitoring the implementation of the SDGs. Sorry, we're running late, so we will not have any more time for question and answer for this session. We will just do a Mentimeter again on what are the key issues related to SDG 5. So this is for you to give your views on what are the key human rights issues related to SDG 5. I only see two now, land rights and non-discrimination. Any? Okay. It's coming up.